May 13th, 1943. Tunisia. The desert wind carried the smell of burning fuel and sand, an invisible haze that blurred the horizon into a molten shimmer. Under the merciless North African sun, a long column of men trudged westward, boots sinking into the hot earth. Their uniforms were once crisp Feldgrau, the proud gray of the Wehrmacht. Now they were coated in dust and shame. These were the soldiers of General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's Afrika Korps, defeated, disarmed, and exhausted. The war that had begun with thunder and victory in Europe had ended here, in silence. Allied trucks rumbled past, kicking up clouds that settled on the bowed heads of prisoners. Every few miles, they stopped to rest, their canteens empty, their mouths dry from days without proper rations. Above them, circling like steel vultures, P-38 Lightnings glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of who now controlled the skies. Obergefreiter Karl Weber, 24 years old from Bremen, had been a radio operator in the 10th Panzer Division. He carried with him a single photograph, his wife, Lotte, and their newborn son. He had fought through El Alamein, had seen men incinerated in tank turrets, and had listened to propaganda broadcasts promising that Germany would soon drive the British into the sea. Now, he watched a convoy of Allied soldiers hand out water bottles to the men in front of him. One of them, a tall American with a bandaged arm, offered Karl his flask. "Here," the American said simply. "Drink." Karl hesitated, then accepted. The water was warm, but it was the first kindness he had seen in months. As the prisoners were herded into makeshift enclosures under canvas tents, rumors began to spread. They whispered that they were not being sent to England, or to die in the desert, but across the ocean, to America. That night, under a sky scattered with foreign stars, Karl lay awake listening to the distant hum of engines. He wondered if the Americans were taking them to work camps, or perhaps to some remote prison island. The older soldiers murmured that they would be treated as slaves, forced to dig roads or mines. None of them could imagine that their next chapter would be one of the strangest ironies of the war. For the victors, this was a logistical triumph. For the defeated, it was the beginning of an unexpected education. By late May 1943, the U.S. Army began Operation Bolero, the mass transport of Axis prisoners from North Africa to the United States. Thousands of Germans boarded Liberty ships under heavy guard, their wrists bound loosely with rope, guarded by young American MPs scarcely older than themselves. The sea voyage was long and monotonous. On the third day, when a convoy escort dropped depth charges against a suspected submarine, panic swept through the holds. Karl clutched his knees, waiting for the explosion that never came. When, after 2 weeks, land finally appeared on the horizon, green and vast, it did not resemble anything he had imagined. This was not war-torn Europe. This was a world untouched. As the ships approached the port of Norfolk, Virginia, the Germans fell silent. The docks stretched endlessly, lined with cranes and rail cars. Smoke rose from factories that seemed to run day and night. Even the air smelled different, cleaner, yet charged with the pulse of industry. To many of them, including Karl, it felt as if they had arrived not in a country, but in the future. When they disembarked, the first thing they noticed was not the guards' rifles, but their demeanor. The Americans looked curious rather than cruel. They handed out cigarettes and sandwiches. One MP, seeing Karl's confusion, simply said, "You'll be fine, just follow the rules." As the prisoners boarded trains bound for camps across the Midwest and South, Karl pressed his face against the window and watched a new world roll by. Towns with bright neon signs, fields of corn stretching beyond sight, children waving at the trains, carrying their nation's enemies. The thought struck him then, clear and painful. This is what we were fighting against? And he wasn't sure whether to feel pride or regret. That night, as the train crossed into Illinois, a voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Next stop, Camp Grant." The prisoners exchanged glances. None of them had heard of it before. By dawn, they would arrive at the heart of America and discover a prison unlike any they had ever imagined. June 2nd, 1943, Camp Grant, Illinois. The sun had barely risen when the train's brakes screamed against the rails, slowing to a halt beside a vast stretch of open prairie. Dew shimmered across endless fields. Beyond the barbed wire perimeter stood rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, and American flags flapping in the wind. A sign near the gate read simply, "U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp." The prisoners stepped down one by one, blinking against the early light. Carl Weber carried his small satchel, expecting barking guards, snarling dogs, and maybe the butt of a rifle to the ribs. But instead, an officer with polished boots and a clipboard stepped forward and began calling names. His tone was calm, businesslike, more bureaucrat than brute. "Welcome to Camp Grant," he said. "Follow the signs. You'll be processed, issued uniforms, and assigned quarters. No trouble, no punishment. Work will be assigned soon." The Germans looked at one another in disbelief. "Welcome?" one muttered. Did he say welcome? They were led through the gates, where a military band was rehearsing in the distance. The crisp sound of trumpets echoed across the camp, an oddly cheerful soundtrack for captured men. Inside, the prisoners were given medical checks, deloused, and handed clean khaki uniforms stenciled with PW in large black letters. It was humiliating, yet strangely humane. Carl was issued a cot in Barrack 18 alongside men from Bavaria, Saxony, and Austria. There were rules, strict but simple. No escape attempts, no violence, no Nazi propaganda. In return, they would receive 3 meals a day, medical care, and pay for labor. By evening, when the camp siren signaled dinner, the Germans filed into the mess hall. The aroma stopped them in their tracks. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, bread, and coffee. For men who had eaten sand and canned horse meat in Africa, it was a banquet. One soldier, Unteroffizier Müller, laughed out loud. "If this is prison," he said between mouthfuls, "then we lost the wrong war." Around them, American guards watched with bemused detachment. They were farm boys and factory workers, not hardened soldiers. Many didn't even hate the Germans. To them, these prisoners were just another duty in a war far away. When one guard noticed Carl staring at his plate in disbelief, he smirked. "Get used to it, pal. There's plenty more where that came from." That night, the barracks buzzed with low conversation. The men compared notes on what they had seen, the vastness of America, the orderliness of the camp, the casual confidence of their captors. It was all so ordinary. No hatred, no speeches, no ideology, just efficiency and comfort. A week later, work assignments began. Some men were sent to local farms to pick corn or harvest wheat. Others were tasked with maintaining the camp, repairing fences, or working in nearby lumber mills. For every hour of labor, they earned script, paper money redeemable at the camp canteen. And the canteen itself felt like a small miracle. Carl stepped inside one afternoon and froze. There were shelves of candy, soap, postcards, and even magazines in German translation. The clerk, a cheerful American sergeant, greeted him with a grin. "Go on, pick something. You've got credit." Carl bought a bar of chocolate and a notebook. That night, he wrote a letter to his wife, though he knew it might never reach her. "I am a prisoner," he wrote, "but I am not suffering. The Americans are not what they told us they would be. They are strange. They smile too easily. They talk too much, but they treat us like men." Soon, the rhythm of camp life became almost normal. Mornings began with roll call and coffee. Work occupied the day. In the evenings, music drifted from the recreation hall, sometimes American jazz, sometimes a harmonica played by a German soldier who once performed in Berlin cafes. The guards listened, tapping their boots in time. The war, which had seemed endless in the desert, now felt like something distant, an echo from another life. But beneath the calm surface, small shifts began. The propaganda many of them had believed in so fiercely was starting to unravel. It wasn't defeat that broke their certainty. It was kindness. One night in July, Carl joined a few others outside the barracks, staring at the night sky. The Milky Way blazed overhead, untouched by searchlights or sirens. "I can't believe this is real," said Feldwebel Otto Richter, a former teacher from Hamburg. "They feed us, they pay us, they even let us play music. This country, it doesn't make sense." Carl nodded slowly. Maybe that's the point. In the coming months, they would learn baseball, read American newspapers, and attend English lessons taught by volunteer instructors. The prisoners of war, once agents of a brutal regime, were about to witness a version of freedom more powerful than any weapon. And for many, it would change them forever. Autumn 1943. The Illinois air had grown cool and sharp, carrying the scent of cornfields and wet leaves. Camp Grant shimmered in the soft gold of early evening, its fences casting long shadows across the ground. By now, the German prisoners had settled into a strange rhythm of existence, half soldiers, half civilians. Carl Weber worked 6 days a week on a nearby farm owned by the Miller family. The drive out of camp each morning was an event in itself. The army trucks rattled down dirt roads, filled with prisoners singing half-heartedly under their breath. The guards sat up front, smoking, barely watching them anymore. None of the Germans had tried to escape. Why would they? There was nowhere to go. The Miller farm was unlike anything Carl had known in war-torn Europe. The land stretched for miles, rich and orderly, with white fences and red barns. The Millers, Henry, his wife Clara, and their 2 children, treated the POWs as hired help rather than captives. When Carl repaired a broken irrigation pump, Henry slapped him on the back and said, "Good work, fella. You Germans sure know machines." That night, the Millers invited the work crew to share lunch under a walnut tree. They sat together eating cornbread, ham, and sweet tea. The Americans didn't ask about the war. They didn't talk about ideology or Hitler. They just talked about the harvest, the weather, and baseball. Carl watched the children chase each other across the yard. They were laughing, unafraid, unscarred. He thought of his own son, a child he had never met. For the first time since Tunisia, his chest tightened not with fear, but with longing. Later that week, an American Red Cross representative arrived at the camp to distribute mail. For many prisoners, it was the first letter from home in over a year. Some cried. Others folded the paper neatly and read it again and again under their blankets. Carl's letter came from his wife, written in careful script. Lotte Weber, Bremen, June 21st, 1943. She wrote of air raids, ration cards, and scarcity. "We are told the war is going well," she said, "but the bread grows thinner, and the nights grow longer." Carl sat for a long time, staring at her words. Outside, a train whistle echoed across the fields, a sound of abundance, not hunger. The contradictions gnawed at him. He had believed Germany was destined to rule a new world order. Yet here he was, surrounded by one. Built not on terror, but on production, liberty, and laughter. That night, he and his bunkmate Otto sat on the steps of the barracks, watching fireflies flicker beyond the fence. Otto said quietly, Maybe we were lied to. Carl didn't answer. The truth didn't need words. By winter, Camp Grant transformed. Snow blanketed the roofs, and the prisoners built makeshift Christmas decorations from scrap wood and tin foil. The Americans even allowed them to hold a small service in the recreation hall. A chaplain, an old Lutheran pastor captured in Africa, read from a borrowed English Bible. When he finished, one of the guards surprised everyone by standing and saying softly, "Merry Christmas, boys." He set down a crate filled with coffee tins and cookies from the townspeople. The Germans applauded, laughing, calling out thanks in broken English. For a moment, the war vanished entirely. Not all camps were so idyllic. Reports from other states told of stricter regimes, isolation, and occasional abuse. But in Camp Grant, the system worked precisely because it leaned on fairness and routine. The Geneva Convention was upheld meticulously. The Americans believed that by treating their captives with dignity, they could prove something greater than military victory, that democracy itself was a weapon. It worked. In January 1944, the camp newspaper, the Camp Times, published its first German-language supplement, written by prisoners. It featured essays, humor, and even editorials debating the war's progress. One article questioned whether National Socialism had deceived an entire generation. The editors were reprimanded mildly, but the paper continued. Carl began volunteering in the camp's small library. He learned English through children's books, then moved on to the Saturday Evening Post. The more he read, the more impossible it became to reconcile the picture of barbaric America, painted by Nazi propaganda, with the living reality around him. Sometimes he would help the guards repair radios in the recreation hall. Through static and fading signals, they caught fragments of the outside world. Roosevelt speeches, jazz broadcasts, and reports from the Eastern Front. One evening, the news broke. The Germans had lost Stalingrad. A heavy silence fell across the room. Otto whispered, "Then it's truly over." Carl nodded, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. He thought of the frozen bodies he had seen in North Africa, the arrogance of command, the endless marching toward death. Perhaps this defeat was mercy. Over the next months, a quiet transformation swept through the camp. The men began to talk openly, without fear. They discussed politics, ethics, the meaning of loyalty. Some even volunteered to help the Americans with agricultural projects in nearby towns. Carl's group built irrigation systems and painted barns. At the end of one job, an elderly farmer pressed a $5 bill into his hand. Carl tried to refuse it. "Take it," the man insisted. "You earned it." The gesture was small, but it shattered years of indoctrination in a single instant. By the summer of 1944, many of the German prisoners no longer saw themselves as enemies, but as men stranded between two worlds, one collapsing under tyranny, the other thriving under freedom. When word came that the Allies had landed in Normandy, the camp erupted in tension. Some cheered quietly. Others clenched their fists in anger. But even the most loyal Nazis could no longer ignore the truth. Germany was losing. That night, Carl wrote in his journal, "The Americans win because they believe in something bigger than flags or fear. They believe in the right of a man to live his own life. Maybe that's the thing we never understood." He closed the notebook, hearing the faint sound of a harmonica from the next barrack, soft, mournful, yet full of peace. Spring, 1945. The wind across Illinois carried the smell of thawing soil and machine oil. In the camp workshops, German prisoners repaired tractors, built furniture, and tuned pianos donated by local churches. On the surface, everything appeared the same. The guards still paced the fences, the flag still flew high, the meals arrived at the same hour each day. Yet beneath that rhythm, something had changed. The war in Europe was collapsing. The rumors spread like wildfire. Berlin surrounded, Hitler missing, the Reich in ruins. The men gathered around radios, their faces pale and quiet, listening to English broadcasts they barely needed translated anymore. When the news finally came, Germany had surrendered. The barracks fell into stunned silence. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, in the back of Barrack 18, someone whispered, "It's over." The words hung in the air like smoke. Carl sat on his cot, hands clasped, eyes unfocused. For years, every hardship, every march, every bullet had been endured in the name of something that no longer existed. He wasn't a soldier now. He wasn't even sure what he was. Outside, the American guards didn't cheer. They simply went about their duties, calm and restrained. When one walked past the German quarters, he stopped briefly, tipped his cap, and said, "Guess you boys are going home soon." But home, Carl realized, was a place buried beneath rubble. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. The prisoners no longer worked in the fields. They attended briefings led by American officers explaining what would happen next. Denazification, repatriation, re-education. Each word carried the weight of both justice and mercy. A new figure appeared in the camp. Captain William Carter, a soft-spoken academic turned intelligence officer. His mission wasn't interrogation. It was transformation. He organized lectures, film screenings, and open discussions in the mess hall. The Germans were shown films of liberated concentration camps. At first, many refused to believe what they saw. Some shouted that it was Allied propaganda. Others turned pale and walked out in silence. Carl stayed. He couldn't look away. When the lights came on, no one spoke. Captain Carter looked at them not with hatred, but with something closer to disappointment. "This," he said quietly, "is what happens when men stop thinking for themselves." That night, Carl couldn't sleep. The images burned into his mind, the skeletal faces, the empty eyes. He thought of the lectures he'd once heard in Bremen about racial destiny and national pride. They felt obscene now, hollow. Otto, his bunkmate, finally said, "If this is true, then everything we fought for was madness." Carl answered, "Maybe this is the lesson we were meant to learn." By June, the prisoners were granted greater freedom within the camp. They could walk the fields, organize sports, even interact with local townspeople under supervision. Baseball became an obsession. At first, the Germans laughed at it. A child's game, they called it. But soon they were playing every evening, clumsy but enthusiastic. The Americans joined in. Teams mixed, language barriers blurred. One afternoon, Carl hit a line drive that sent the ball sailing over the fence. The crowd, both guards and prisoners, cheered. The score didn't matter. For a few seconds, there were no sides, no victors or vanquished. Just men, under the same sun, playing a game. When summer came, news arrived that shocked even the most cynical prisoners. Germany was divided. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets each claimed their zones. Rumors swirled about starvation, chaos, and revenge in Europe. Some men wept openly, fearing for their families trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Letters trickled in. One from Lotta arrived for Carl after months of silence. She wrote of their home destroyed by bombing, of her parents gone, of raising their son in a refugee camp near Hanover. But between the lines, she also wrote of something else. Hope. She had heard that the Americans treated the captured fairly. She prayed Carl would come home different. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his breast pocket, and whispered, "I already am." As repatriation began in late 1945, the camp took on a bittersweet atmosphere. Trains were readied, medical checks conducted. Each man received a small package, uniform, food rations, travel papers, and pay saved from their work. The Americans shook their hands as they boarded. Before Carl left, Captain Carter approached him. "You learned well, Weber," he said. "When you go back, remember what you saw here. Build something better." Carl nodded, too choked to reply. The train clattered eastward through the night. Out the window, the endless fields of the Midwest passed by. Golden, peaceful, limitless. Behind him, the stars over Camp Grant faded into distance. Ahead lay a broken homeland waiting to be rebuilt. He took out his notebook one last time and wrote, "I came here as a soldier of the Reich. I leave as a student of humanity. The Americans conquered us with machines. But what truly defeated us was their mercy." He closed the notebook as dawn broke over the horizon.